Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer.
And I'm Christa Carmen.
And this is...
Murder Coaster.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to part 3 of the tragic life and mysterious death of Edgar Allan Poe. Last week, we saw Edgar's hopes of becoming a Southern aristocrat dashed when his wealthy foster father, John Allan, one of the richest men in all of Virginia, died and left him nothing in his will. Perhaps desperate to have a stable family life, Poe then married his 13-year-old cousin Virginia, binding her mother, his Aunt Maria, to him as a motherly figure he called Muddy. He began writing articles and book reviews for the Southern Literary Messenger, where he gained a reputation as a fierce literary critic, earning himself the name Tomahawk Man. Eventually, he moved to Philadelphia with his little family, where he penned some of his most iconic stories and became known as a great writer of horror and suspense. And it is here, in Philadelphia, where our story continues.
Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Murders in the Rue Morgue. The year 1840 was, in many ways, a golden time for Edgar Allan Poe. He finally had the supportive and loving family he'd always longed for, living with his Aunt Maria, whom he now called Muddy, a pillar of literary support who often acted as his agent, and his young wife Virginia, whom he called Sissy, all of them happily living together in a small row home in Philadelphia with their black cat.
It was an amazingly prolific time. Poe just churning out masterpiece after masterpiece, writing like Gia, The Fall of the House of Usher, The Telltale Heart, The Black Cats, and The Pit and the Pendulum, garnering the attention of Washington Irving, among others. And he was finally making enough money with his literary skills to survive.
Burton's Gentleman's Magazine, where Poe had been working as an assistant editor before having a falling out with the owner, was sold to publisher George Graham, who combined it with his own magazine, Casket, renaming the endeavor Graham's Ladies and Gentlemen's Magazine. And George Graham hired Poe as an editor with a salary of $800 a year.
And while Poe's work at Burton's had been menial proofreading and typesetting, his new editorial work at Graham's had a much more elevated status. And it was agreed that each new issue would carry an article or story by Poe, and he'd receive a contributor's payment on top of his salary.
Poe was 31 years old and at the top of his game. He still hadn't grown his iconic mustache that we know him by today, but sported stylish mutton chops, long sideburns that sliced down his jawline into a knife point. He had boyish features, a gleam in his eye, and a slight smirk to his lips. Basically, completely different than the sullen and bloated mustached man with the sad eyes we'd seen 8 years and come to know him by.
Working at Graham's magazine, Poe revived his articles on cryptography, again having readers send him codes to decipher. He also again became a literary critic, though not as caustic and harsh as his previous reviews, which had earned him the moniker the Tomahawk Man. And under Poe's editorial skills, the magazine became a huge success, jumping from 5,000 subscribers to an astonishing 40,000 subscribers.
And now Edgar was about to create a whole new literary genre, the detective story.
Poe said he wanted to, quote, write something in a new key. He'd long been fascinated with what he called ratiocination, the method of logical deduction he'd used in his article on the robot chess player all those years ago back in Richmond, Virginia. Using this form of detection, he wanted to, quote, create something to plumb the secrets of the human soul, which do not permit themselves to be told.
One of the first of these stories was The Man in the Crowd, where Poe again delved into the inner workings of the criminal mind.
In the story, an unnamed narrator is sitting in a London coffee house, gazing at the crowd and deciphering their different stories with logic. He sees a man whose right ear protrudes and deduces he's a clerk and has often kept a pen behind his ear. He sees another with very large cuffs on his sleeve and deduces that this man is a pickpocket. And when he spots a decrepit old man draped in a cloak, he notices in the shadowy folds both a dagger and a diamond. And he uses ratiocination, or deductive reasoning, to conclude that the old man has used the dagger in some terrible crime in order to steal the diamond.
The narrator then follows the old man into the most deplorable depths of the city, a place of pestilence and filth, hoping to discover his secrets, but in the end gives up his quest, saying of the old man,
He is the type and the genius of deep crime. He refuses to be alone. He is the man of the crowd. It will be in vain to follow, for I shall learn no more of him, nor of his deeds.
And now Poe set to writing a new story focused on ratiocination, a story called The Murders in the Rue Trianen-Baz.
Poe envisioned a master of deductive reasoning, a detective, though that word did not exist yet, named Monsieur C. Auguste Dupin, who lives an almost monastic life in a, quote, time-eaten and grotesque mansion in Paris, with the narrator, who's his roommate, whom he'd met in an obscure library where they were both seeking out the same esoteric book.
The two come upon a newspaper article about a shocking and horrific double murder, which baffles police. A woman and her daughter had been horribly mutilated, the mother's throat cut so deeply as to nearly decapitate her head. Their room devastated and torn apart. The daughter found stuffed feet first up the chimney, covered in bruises.
All of the doors and windows were locked from the inside, and the chimney became tapered and couldn't be used by anything larger than a cat to get in or out. And most curiously, valuables, including 4,000 francs in gold, were all left untouched, seemingly ruling out robbery.
The police, flummoxed, arrest the bank clerk who had delivered the money to the women. But Monsieur Dupin, who is friends with the bank clerk, knows him to be an honest man, then sets to solve the murder mystery.
He notices one of the windows, which had been nailed shut from the inside, had in fact most likely been opened as the nail was broken, something the inept police had missed. But the window overlooked a 4-story drop. But examining the building, Dupin notices there was a lightning rod nearby and deducts that someone with remarkable agility could have swung from the shutter and leapt to the lightning rod and scurried down.
So the killer is one with incredible strength, great agility and balance, and inhuman savagery, but not motivated by greed at all, since the gold was left untouched.
And Dupin finds the barbarity to be literally inhuman, and most importantly, finds unusual hair clutched in the hand of one of the victims.
So Dupont concludes the killer is not human at all, but a ferocious beast, none other than the, quote, large fulvous orangoutang of the East Indian Islands.
The Dupont covertly puts an ad in the newspaper saying he captured an orangutan and listing his address for the owner of the animal to come procure it.
Sure enough, a sailor shows up, confessing he'd brought the creature back with him to sell, but it had stolen his razor and run off into the streets of Paris. And so Dupont's friend, the bank clerk, is released from jail, his innocence proven.
And thus was the first detective story ever written. But believing rightly that the title needed to be something darker, that hinted at the sinister story within, something with a metaphor for death, he changed it from the murders in the Rue Triambas to the murders in the Rue Morgue.
The story, published in the April 1841 issue of Graham's, was a huge success, and Poe was paid an additional $56 for the contribution. A nice chunk of change, equivalent to nearly $2,000 today.
Poe was lauded as a genius, and the story would go on to inspire author Conan Doyle to create Sherlock Holmes. Doyle saying,
It was Poe who taught the possibility of making a detective story a work of literature. His detective is the best detective in fiction. Dupont is unrivaled, a model for all time.
And Doyle would even have his detective, Sherlock Holmes, smoke a pipe, exactly like Poe's detective. And even former FBI agent John Douglas, who we've talked about often on the show, the guy who coined the term serial killer, said this, quote, "Without the pioneering work of such inspired storytellers as Edgar Poe, there is a good chance that modern criminal profiling as we know it would not exist."
But Poe himself, ever the puzzle master, wished to push his ratiocination, or deductive reasoning, even farther, to implicate it in the real world. As he himself would say,
"Where is the ingenuity of unraveling a web which you yourself, the author, have woven for the express purpose of unraveling?"
So Poe set his sights on a subject which often intrigued and inspired him: true crime. After writing the first detective story ever, he now set to write the first murder mystery based on a true crime.
And at that same exact time, in Hoboken, New Jersey, the body of a lovely girl named Mary Rodgers, famous across New York City and beyond as being the Beautiful Cigar Girl, was found floating in the Hudson River, beaten, bound, and horribly violated.
Chapter 2: The Beautiful Cigar Girl.
In July of 1841, the New York Police Gazette ran an article stating,
The annals of crime are gorged with mysteries, but of all the episodes enshrouded in this somber incompleteness, there is none more tantalizing than the case of Mary Cecilia Rodgers, the Beautiful Cigar Girl.
The murder of Mary Cecilia Rodgers was a national sensation. One writer saying, "It marked the terrible moment when New York City lost its innocence." Which, wow, to think New York City had once been innocent, or that much of Upper Manhattan was rural farmland.
When Mary was a teenager, her father died in a steamship explosion, and she and her widowed mother moved from Connecticut to New York City, where they ran a boarding house. To supplement their meager earnings, Mary took a job as a salesgirl in a cigar store, John Anderson's Tobacco Emporium on Lower Broadway.
Anderson was known for making a particularly fine cut of chewing tobacco, very classy, good for spitting into spittoons, which are all the fashion, as it was now seen as uncouth to just spit on the floor.
He also sold individual chaws in bright foil wrappers that stayed fresh. They were used by soldiers in the Mexican-American War and gold miners in California, and were known as, quote, a great solace to the fighting man.
Around the corner was the Shakespeare Tavern, where writers and poets would congregate to drink and talk about literature, like Washington Irving and James Fenimore Cooper, and Edgar was said to have frequented the bar when he lived in the city or passed through. From the tavern, they'd often go to the tobacco shop to indulge in a cigar.
And around the corner was P.T. Barnum's American Museum, where for a quarter, which was actually a lot of money back then, you could see jugglers, ventriloquists, bearded ladies, rubbermen, firewalkers, sword swallowers, and entertainment of the most dazzling sort, right on Broadway at Ann Street.
And further down on Broadway, on land that had once been a freshwater pond, was 5 Points, the world's worst slum, composed of slaughterhouses, glue factories, turpentine distilleries, and Murderer's Alley, where the city's blackest hearts gathered.
As Reverend Matthew Hale Smith said of 5 Points,
a region of wickedness, filth, and woe. Children are born in sorrow, and raised in reeking vice and bestiality that no heathen degradation can exceed.
And at 399 Broadway was Anderson's Tobacco Emporium, where Mary Rodgers worked, a young woman described as, quote, ethereal and hypnotically pleasing, with a dark smile. Interesting, they spelled cigars S-E-E-G-A-R-S back then, like cigars.
This is long before cigarette girls selling tobacco products became an iconic image of the Roaring Twenties. In the early 1800s, though it was a regular practice in Europe, hiring attractive shop girls was seen as unseemly in America, especially in such an unsavory place as a tobacco shop, where, quote, the rough manners of some of the patrons may have a corseting effect on an impressionable young woman, end quote.
And newspapers ran articles saying things like, something should be done instantly to remedy the great evil consequent upon very beautiful girls being placed in cigar and confectionery stores. Designing rich rascals to drop into these places, put cigars and sugar plums, gossip with the girl, and ultimately affect her ruin.
But as a sales tactic, it worked. Men flocked to the cigar store to see the raven-haired beauty with the dark smile. She was incredibly charming. Poems about her were published in the paper. Even Washington Irving visited the store to see the charming and beautiful cigar store girl. And most likely, so had Poe.
She became a celebrity, famous simply for being famous, kind of like an e-girl or Instagram model would be today. As one newspaper at the time put it,
it was a most curious thing, for notoriety is unencumbered by position or achievement.
On July 25th, 1841, the beautiful cigar girl Mary told her fiancé Daniel Payne that she would be visiting her aunt and other family members. 3 days later, on July 28th, fishermen found her corpse floating in the Hudson River in Hoboken, New Jersey.
3 days in the water, followed by several hours in the hot sun when she was drawn to the shore to await authorities, had done much. But the coroner, a Dr. Cook, did an amazing job. And in this coroner's report, you can see minds at work, much like Edgar's, using reasoning and deductive skills.
At first, it was assumed Mary had just fallen off a boat into the Hudson somehow and drowned. But the coroner, Dr. Cook, who'd seen many drowning victims, immediately doubted this. As he says in the report, quote, the face, when I examined it, was suffused with bruised blood. There was frothy blood still issuing from the mouth, but no foam, which issues from the mouth of persons who die by drowning. Her face was swollen,
The veins were highly distended. If she had been drowned, there would not have been those particular appearances that I found in the veins. If she had been drowned, the discoloration would have been in the cellular tissue and not in the veins. Also, her arms, frozen in rigor mortis, were bent over the chest, not extended like someone who had drowned.
Cook then discovered bruising along her neck, in particular a deep bruise about the size and shape of a man's thumb on the right side of her neck. Cook stated that these marks, quote,
led me to believe she had been throttled and partially choked by a man's hand.
Then, examining the neck closer, Cook made a horrifying discovery. As he said,
I observed a crease around the neck. I accidentally felt a small knot and found that a piece of lace was tied so tightly round her neck as to have been hidden from sight in the flesh of the neck. This was tied in a hard knot under the left ear.
Then large patches of raw skin on her back and shoulders led the coroner to believe that, quote,
struggling to get free while being brutally held down on her back to effect her violation, these marks were made before death, as coagulation had been found in the cellular tissues. This outrage was effected while she was laid down upon some hard substance, a hard-board floor, the bottom of a board, or something similar. It convinces me fully that the outrage was not effected on a bed.
Clusters of bruises and abrasions in the, quote, feminine region, along with tearing and trauma, forced the coroner to conclude she had been, quote,
brutally violated by no fewer than 3 assailants and finally murdered. Abrasions on the wrists confirmed that her hands had been lashed together with sturdy rope. The hands had been tied, probably, while the body was violated, and untied before she was thrown in the water.
The corpse had been reclothed after death, and some items of clothing, like her gloves and kerchief, were missing. But her hat had been pulled forcibly onto her head and tied beneath the chin with a sailor's slip knot. And a strip of her dress had been ripped and wound around her body as a hitch or a handle to pull and drag the corpse. It's pretty Twin Peaks, isn't it?
Yeah, just awful. Oh, because the coroner said she'd been assaulted by at least 3 men, it was generally agreed upon that Mary had been grabbed by some New York City gang, viciously beaten and raped, strangled to death, then thrown into the Hudson, where her body floated into Hoboken.
The newspapers ran articles saying,
it is a matter of certainty that the unfortunate Mary Rodgers has been a victim of one of the numerous bands of blackguards which infest the vicinity of the city.
Though other newspapers then went and theorized that the body wasn't even of the Beautiful Cigar Girls, that it had been misidentified and Mary was still alive, and that a person who'd been dead for just 3 days would not have been floating.
The case was filled with red herrings and bizarre clues. Mary had actually disappeared once before without explanation, leading to further speculation that she was still alive. Then a thicket was discovered near an infamous tavern where her petticoat, scarf, gloves, and a pocket handkerchief were found. Scraps of her dress entwined in the brambles and signs of a fierce struggle, leading investigators to believe they'd discovered the crime scene.
But unfortunately, that scene had been originally discovered by 2 young boys who had taken the clothing and scraps back to their mother, basically destroying the crime scene.
Then seemingly reliable witnesses came forward, saying Mary had been seen in the night she disappeared in the company of a swarthy man shortly before she disappeared.
Because the knot used to fasten her hat to her head was a slip knot, and because of the hitch that had been made out of her dress to drag her, it was suspected that the killer might be a sailor. And a sailor that was familiar with Mary was arrested, but he ended up having an alibi and was soon released. Other suspects came and went. Other people were arrested and released. People turned in their neighbors. Anonymous letters were even sent to the press.
Then, to add further layers of intrigue to the case, her fiancé, who'd been completely ruled out as a suspect, committed suicide by drinking laudanum, leaving a note that read,
"To the world, here I am on the very spot. May God forgive me for a misspent life."
Philadelphia's Saturday Evening Post reprinted all the coverage of the case. And of course, Edgar Allan Poe, who once wrote, "The death of a beautiful woman is unquestionably the most poetical topic in the world," followed the case very carefully, studying it, taking notes, using his techniques of ratiocination.
Chapter 3. Consumption comes to Philadelphia.
On January 19th, Edgar Allan Poe turned 33 years old. He was at the peak of his literary skills, having just invented the detective story, enjoying success and planning for the future. His Muddy encouraged his literary ambitions, helping him organize his letters and effects, answering correspondences. His beautiful wife, Virginia, now 19 years old, was becoming a lovely woman whom Edgar adored.
They weren't living in the best of places, just a little row home across the street from a sewage lot, where the contents of Philadelphia's latrines and outhouses were dumped and spread to be made into fertilizer. It's really gross, but it could have been worse, and things were all looking up. Poe's star was rising. He still held great hopes of having his own literary magazine, and his boss Graham had even promised to help him launch it.
The day after his birthday, Poe was lounging in the small parlor with Muddy and Virginia, idly listening as Virginia sang and played the harp. Edgar encouraged Virginia to endeavor in all of the arts, including music. There are other accounts saying that Virginia was in fact playing piano while Edgar joined her on his flute.
As Virginia, dressed all in white, sang, reaching for a high note, her voice straining upwards, he paused a moment, clutched her throat, coughed, and a torrent of blood rushed up and out of her mouth.
She'd suffered a pulmonary hemorrhage. More and more blood began to usher up from her, so much that when Edgar went rushing to her, he thought she'd ruptured a blood vessel.
Edgar carried Virginia up the steps to their bedroom, where he lay her in her bed, coughing up blood, struggling to breathe for weeks. Doctors were called, and they all said he could die at any moment.
It was consumption, the wasting away disease, tuberculosis, the same horrible disease that had killed Poe's mother, father, brother, possibly even Fanny as well. In the 1800s, it caused 1 out of every 4 deaths. As Edgar would later say,
"Her life was despaired of. I took leave of her forever and underwent all the agonies of her death. But then she recovered partially, and again, I hope."
As Poe's boss, George Graham, would recount, "Love for his wife was a sort of rapturous worship of the spirit of beauty which he felt was fading before his eyes. I have seen him hovering around her when she was ill, with all the fond fear and tender anxiety of a mother for her firstborn, her slightest cough causing in him a shudder, a heart chill that was visible."
While Virginia set to getting well and recovering, Poe wrote his masterpiece, The Mask of the Red Death, about a blood-inducing disease the rich and powerful seek to hide from, but in the end, cannot escape.
Poe would say about the fatal pestilence,
"Blood was its avatar, and its seal the redness and the horror of blood."
And if you want to hear that iconic story of death and horror, just listen to our Christmas bonus episode from last week. Poe also wrote Eleonora during this time. stating of the young and beautiful cousin of the narrator.
She had seen that the finger of death was upon her bosom, that like the ephemeron, she had been made in perfect loveliness, only to die.
Chapter 4. Dickens.
In March of 1842, the famous English novelist Charles Dickens was coming to Philadelphia during his tour of America, and Poe, in his role as editor of Graham's magazine, requested an interview, sending along a copy of Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, as well as copies of his reviews praising Dickens.
The two met at the United States Hotel in Philadelphia on March 7, 1842, and Dickens was much taken with Edgar.
By the end of the meeting, the two had become fast friends, and Dickens promised Edgar he'd find some English publishers for his work. Poe and Dickens would remain friends, corresponding through the mail, and when Dickens returned to America in 1867, long after Poe's death, he visited his Aunt Maria to give his condolences and even left her with some money.
One interesting thing to note was that Dickens had once had a pet raven, a talkative and rambunctious bird named Grip, that would attack children. When he died, Dickens had him stuffed. That bird is now on display in the Free Library in Philadelphia, the same city the two men met in. And the title character in Dickens' novel, Barnaby Ridge, also had a talkative pet raven, also named Grip. Poe particularly liked this part of the novel, but thought it could have been expanded on and used in a more poetic manner. Writing about it in a review,
The Raven, intensely amusing as it is, might have been made more than we now see it a portion of the conception of the fantastic. Its croaking might have been pathetically heard in the course of the drama.
And so Poe began to think of a story about a pet raven who had been taught to say nevermore, and escaped from its owner, and flew into someone's house, terrifying them. In particular, someone who was grief-stricken and intoxicated, who had quaffed that kind nepenthe and was lost in the effects of alcohol and laudanum. And a super quick note, there's a very, for anyone with kids out there that listens to the podcast, there's a book that my daughter loves that's called A Raven Named Grip, How a Bird Inspired Two Famous Writers, Charles Dickens and Edgar Allan Poe. It's by Marilyn Singer, and it's very good.
Oh, that sounds awesome. Didn't know that one.
Yeah.
Did you ever go to Philadelphia and see it?
So I didn't, I'm embarrassed to say that, like, even loving Poe and loving Dickens in high school the way I did, I didn't know that the bird was, I went to school in Philadelphia and I never saw it or went there. And when I read this book to my daughter, and there's, you know, a section in the back that talks about where the raven is, the stuffed raven is today. And when I saw that it was there, I mean, like, I definitely, whenever I get back there, we'll go to see it. But yeah, total bummer. I did not. I lived there for 4 years and never saw it.
Well, but Poe's enthusiasm working as editor of Graham's magazine was sadly beginning to fade. Like every other job he had editing in a magazine, Poe was beginning to feel unappreciated. The sudden surge in subscribers was earning Graham a fortune, while Edgar was still making the same sum and basically living as a pauper beside a yard for human waste disposal.
And when Poe asked Graham to advance him 2 months' salary to care for Virginia, he refused. And remember, Graham had promised to help Poe launch his own magazine, but was now showing no interest in that. As Poe would put it,
Every exertion made by myself served to make Graham's a greater source of profit and left its owner less willing to keep his word with me.
Poe and Graham began to argue, sensitive Poe feeling constantly slighted, and eventually they parted, Poe saying he resigned out of disgust with the, quote, namby-pamby character of the magazine and the insulting salary, end quote.
Namby-pamby. You don't hear that one that often anymore.
We should bring it back.
After Poe left, Graham then hired Rufus Griswold as Poe's replacement. Yes, old Rufus, who we mentioned in the first episode, the man who would write that scandalous obituary.
The stress of poverty, Virginia wasting away, always within the horizon of literary and financial success, but never quite making it there. Poe turned where he always did, the bottle. As French poet Charles Baudelaire would put it later, Poe did not drink like an ordinary topper, but like a savage, with an altogether American energy and fear of wasting a minute, as though he was accomplishing an act of murder, as though there was something inside him he had to kill. Man, that's a great description of an alcoholic if I ever heard one.
Totally. In 1842, Leah and Blanchard, who had published Poe's collection of short stories, Tales of the Grotesque and Arabesque, published a true crime novel by William Gilmore Simms entitled Beauchamp, about the 1825 Beauchamp Sharp murder, the Kentucky tragedy, that Poe himself had attempted to make into a play years earlier, where doomed lovers had attempted suicide on death row in prison, she dying, and he living only to be hanged the next day.
Poe loved the true crime book, writing in a review that while Simms at times used inaccurate English and was prone to revolting images, he was immeasurably the best writer in America, saying, quote, "The events upon which this novel is based are but too real. No more thrilling, no more romantic tragedy did ever the brain of poet conceive than was the tragedy of Sharp and Beauchamp."
And the book was a huge success. True crime has always been popular. And Poe again began to think about writing in the true crime genre and began thinking about the murder of the beautiful cigar girl, now over a year old, which was still unsolved.
What if he, like his fictional detective, Auguste Dupin, could solve the crime right from the armchair of his living room? And he could write the story as if it was Dupin who had solved the crime, setting it in Paris instead of New York City. And instead of a cigar store, it would be a perfume shop. Instead of the Hudson River, it would be the Seine. But other than that, all the other details would be exactly the same.
And making it fictional and setting it in Paris would relieve him of any accusation of slander, especially as he planned to harp about the police being inept and bungling the case. And if details didn't match up exactly, he could just blame the change of setting.
2 months later, Poe wrote his friend Evan Snodgrass, editor of Baltimore's Sunday Visitor, the journal that had awarded him first place for his story MS Found in a Bottle, starting his letter with,
"Have I offended you by my evil deeds? If so, how?"
This was just Poe's weird way of chastising Snodgrass for not writing him more often. Poe was quite the character. He then continues,
"You may remember a tale of mine entitled The Murders in the Rue Morgue. Its theme was the exercise of ingenuity in detecting a murder. I am now just putting the concluding touch to a similar article I shall entitle The Mystery of Marie Roget, a sequel to the murders in the Rue Morgue. The story is based upon that of the real murder of Mary Cecilia Rodgers, which created so vast an excitement in New York. I have handled my design in a manner altogether novel in literature. I have imagined a series of nearly exact coincidences occurring in Paris. Thus, under pretense of showing how Dupin unraveled the mystery of Marie's assassination, I, in reality, enter into a very long and rigorous analysis of the New York tragedy. No point is omitted. I believe not only that I have demonstrated the fallacy of the general idea that the girl was the victim of a gang of ruffians, but have indicated the assassin in a matter that will give renewed impetus to the investigation. I am desirous of publishing it in Baltimore, and there would be no channel so proper as under your control. Now the tale is a long one, and is worth to me $100 at the usual magazine price. But if you are willing to publish it, I will say $40?
But Snodgrass didn't want the story, so Poe instead submitted it to Snowdon's Ladies' Companion, a publication he'd previously derided for its, quote, ill taste and humbuggery.
Humbuggery. And they accepted it. But because of its length, 20,000 words, it's easily one of Poe's longest works, which is about 5 or 6 times longer than most of his stories. They decided to publish it in 3 sections over 3 months.
Chapter 5, The Mystery of Marie Roget.
In October, Part 1 of The Mystery of Marie Roget by Edgar Allan Poe was published in the Snowdon's Ladies' Companion.
It's quite evident that Poe had pored over the autopsy report, studying it fastidiously, and echoing its points, saying,
"The face was suffused with dark blood, some of which issued from the mouth. No foam was seen as in the case of the merely drowned. There was no discoloration of the cellular tissue. About the throat were bruises and impressions of finger. A piece of lace was found tied so tightly around the neck as to be hidden from sight. It was completely buried in the flesh and was fastened by a knot which lay just under the left ear."
He describes his method of deduction that will be used to solve the crime as a calculus of probabilities that will apply, quote, the most rigidly exact aspects of science to the intangible shadow and spirituality of speculation.
He then scrutinizes all of the prevalent theories, the first being that she was abducted by a gang of ruffians, which he disputes. He points to the thicket where the crime was believed to have taken place, the signs of struggle, the scraps of clothes caught in the branches, saying, "What struggle could have taken place? What struggle so violent and enduring as to have left its traces in all directions between a weak and defenseless girl and a gang of ruffians imagined? The silent grasp of a few rough arms and all would have been over."
He then focuses on the hitch used to drag the body away, concluding that if the murder had been committed by a gang, they simply would have carried her away to the river rather than taking the time to fashion a cloth hitch, further saying a gang wouldn't have left scraps of clothing behind, as there'd have been extra hands to gather all incriminating evidence.
Poe concludes that the crime scene can only be understood if we, quote, imagine but one violator.
He states a single man would have had to struggle to overpower her, would have had to use a hitch to pull her, and would have been too burdened to gather all the stray articles of clothing. He solidifies this theory by saying the large reward would have been too much temptation for a group of men. One of them would have surely cracked and attempted to collect it, saying,
"It is not to be imagined for a moment that some member of a gang of low ruffians or of any body of men would not long ago have betrayed his accomplices. Each one of a gang betrays eagerly and early that he may not himself be betrayed. That the secret has not been divulged is the very best proof that it is in fact a secret. The horrors of this dark deed are known only to one living human being and to God."
He then turns to the idea that Maria could still be alive, and the body mistakenly presumed to be hers, and uses forensic science to refute the notion saying that she may have never sunk to the bottom to begin with, saying,
Experience has shown that drowned bodies or bodies thrown into the water immediately after death by violence require from 6 to 10 days for sufficient decomposition to take place to bring them to the top of the water. The stomach gas is produced by the cetus fermentation of vegetable matter or the matter in which a person with an abnormal quantity of flaccid or fatty matter might actually be expected to remain afloat long after drowning. The body will not sink until decomposition has so far progressed as to permit the escape of the generated gases.
We should note here that this is being published in a very prim and proper ladies' magazine. Talk of the stomach gases of corpses and decomposition of bodies was pretty wild stuff. So Poe had invented the science fiction story, the detective story, written the first murder mystery based on a true story, and now was inventing the modern forensic science story as well, a precursor to shows like Forensic Files, CSI, and The First 48.
Having used ratiocination to prove that it was not a gang of ruffians, that it logically had to be a single perpetrator in the second installment, which came out in November, Poe had his master detective Dupin come up with bits of information extracted from newspapers, which he claims will combine to reveal the identity of the killer.
The newspaper articles were all about how Mary had once briefly disappeared 3 years before the murder. It had caused a bit of a wave at the time, the disappearance of the beautiful cigar girl, her mother frantic, but Mary had soon returned, and it was later discovered that, quote, she was in the company of a young naval officer, much noted for his debaucheries. A quarrel providentially led to her return home.
Not many people would have actually been aware of this. It came and went quickly in the gossip column. But Poe had been living in New York City at the time and drinking with his writer comrades at the Shakespeare Tavern. So, of course, he would have been very aware of this mysterious disappearance.
In the final installment, which was all set to come out in December, Poe used the same type of character profiling that the FBI does today, trying to put himself in the mind of the killer in order to better understand the crime and find the perpetrator. He describes the murderer cowering beside the corpse of the beautiful young girl, saying,
He is appalled by what lies motionless before him. The fury of his passion is over, and there is abundant room in his heart for the natural awe of the deed. He has none of that confidence which the presence of numbers inevitably inspires. He is alone with the dead. He trembles and is bewildered.
Poe envisioned the murderer dragging the corpse to the river, using the improvised hitch, planning to come back for her petticoat, gloves, and handkerchief, but doesn't, as Poe says.
The return of that lonely murderer over the toilsome and perilous path to the thicket and its blood-chilling recollections. He returns not. Let the consequences be what they may. He could not return. His sole thought is immediate escape. He turns his back forever upon those dreadful shrubberies and flees as from the wrath to come.
Poe then harkens back to the mysterious disappearance of Mary 3 years earlier, saying whomever she'd run off with then, the rapscallion naval officer, must have been on duty and in service, and that the time between the two disappearances was equal to the time of a naval ship going out to sea and then returning. While at sea, he had fantasized about killing her for having scorned him, then returned and put his foul plan in effect, and logic insists that the mysterious naval officer is most likely the murderer.
This explained who the swarthy, mysterious stranger was. It was that mysterious naval officer. It explained why a sailor's knot had been used to fasten the hat and the cloth hitch used to drag the body. It explained the time period between the two disappearances. All of the mysteries tied up in a nice little bow.
He'd solved the crime. Ta-da! And right from his armchair, using logical deduction.
Edgar hoped that the story of Marie Roget would be as big of a hit as the murders in the Rue Morgue and return him to the status he'd had before leaving Graham's magazine. Perhaps help him in his dream of launching his own literary journal, the final installment revealing the naval officer to be the culprit of the crime was all set to be published at the height of the December holidays, and he hoped it would be the talk of New York City.
Then, in November, just as the second installment was being published, the New York Tribune ran the headline, "The Mary Rodgers Mystery Explained."
The article was all about a woman named Frederica Loss, who was the proprietor of Nick Moore's Tavern, that infamous place which lay near the murder thicket.
Frederica Loss had been accidentally shot in the knee by her son as he cleaned his shotgun. The wound grew septic, and she eventually succumbed to the infection and died. When she died, her sons were said to have fretted that hidden secrets were soon to be revealed.
And the New York rumor mill went crazy. What could these secrets be? Could it have to do with the death of the beautiful cigar girl? And then came the story that the tavern was being used as an underground abortion clinic.
Abortion was legal at this time, most of them medication-induced, using herbs such as ergot, calomel, and black hellebore to produce a miscarriage. But surgical abortions were common as well. The only restrictions on abortions in New York was that surgical abortions had to be performed before what they called the quickening, when the fetus began to actively move, around 4 months.
And most folks at this time, going by the Bible, believed life began when a baby took its first breath, citing Genesis 2:7 that the breath of life made man a living being. And many also thought that the ordeal of bitter waters in Numbers 5:11 referred to an herbally induced miscarriage. So abortion was really not a big issue. But the 1840s was the very point in history when abortion first became a political issue in America. Most historians seeing it as a combination of elite white men trying to further secure dominion over women's bodies, and right-wing rabble-rousers trying to secure votes through controversy.
In fact, at the same time that Mary Rodgers went missing, the newspapers were filled with stories about abortionist Madame Restel, whose real name was Anne Lohman.
Anne Lohman was a very talented midwife with a great understanding of the female reproductive system. She was also rich and powerful, exactly the kind of woman feared by misogynistic white male leaders at the time. Also, the kind of woman that would have been burned at the stake just 150 years earlier.
With her husband, Anne developed and patented a number of different preventative powders and monthly pills, advertising in newspapers under the name Madame Restel and selling them through the mail. They also received medical schooling to become actual surgeons, providing surgical abortions for clients when all else failed.
They operated out of a huge brownstone mansion on the corner of 5th Avenue and 52nd Street, and also had a network of abortion parlors that stretched out into New Jersey.
But trouble began in 1840 when a patient named Maria Purdy accused Anne of causing consumption through the abortion procedure, saying it was abortions that caused the dreaded wasting away disease.
Yeah, this is just crazy, and it shows how little understood tuberculosis was. And of course, we did a whole episode on Mercy Brown and how vampires were believed to be the cause of consumption, which is a theory that would come about decades later.
The press picked up on this, calling Anne the mistress of death, and said her mansion was built on a foundation of baby skulls. They published drawings of Anne as a scowling witch cradling a bat-winged monster with a dead baby clenched in its teeth.
And readers were eating it up. The controversy was selling newspapers. But Anne maintained her innocence and even promised monetary compensation to anyone who could prove that her methods were dangerous.
But these first rumblings of abortion fever in America were making the newspapers a lot of money, so they latched on to the case of the Beautiful Cigar Girl, saying her death was most likely caused by a botched surgical abortion.
A surgical abortion gone wrong would explain why her, quote, female parts had been so bruised and traumatized, originally indicating a gang rape. Also, why she'd been redressed and her hat crudely tied on her head post-mortem.
And the swarthy man she'd been seen with must be none other than the doctor who'd done the surgery.
And the Tribune was the first to claim that Mary Rodgers had died as a result of an abortion, claiming Frederica Loss had actually confessed as much with her dying words. They even went so far as to say that the clothing that had been found in the thicket had originally been sunk in a pond. But when the villainous abortionists and murderers grew worried, they retrieved them from the water and scattered them in the forest.
Then Frederica Loss's sons were arrested as accomplices, and the Tribune proudly declared, quote, "Thus has this fearful mystery, which has struck fear and terror to so many hearts, been at last explained away by circumstances, in which no one can fail to perceive a providential agency."
For Poe, it was an absolute disaster. Devastating, in fact. He felt he had staked everything on the premises formed in his final installment of his murder mystery, that the murderer had been a mysterious naval officer, and the idea of an abortion had never even entered his mind. How could he have failed to see that? The calculus of probabilities, his methods of ratiocination, it all failed him.
Instead of resting on his laurels, wondering if it was an abortion gone wrong that killed her, why were there so many signs of strangulation? The bruises around the neck, the piece of lace wrapped so tightly around her throat. And why did that hollow in the thicket appear to be a place of such struggle? And who was this mystery doctor, this swarthy man, this surgical abortionist? And there was absolutely no evidence that the tavern was being used as an underground abortion clinic. None. It really didn't make any sense.
And then, Gibre Meret, the doctor to whom the confession had supposedly been whispered to, spoke up, saying he'd never been given a confession. In fact, Frederica Loss was basically unconscious the entire time and couldn't speak at all. And this statement was published in the rival newspaper, The Courier.
But the Tribune wouldn't back down, saying, well, the confession may not have been to him, but there was definitely a confession made sometime before she died, citing, "We gave the facts as they were told to us by 2 magistrates of this city, and confirmed by the mayor himself."
And meanwhile, Edgar Poe was just freaking the fuck out, thinking the critics would be ruthless with him when the final installment of his story was published in December. And all the enemies he made over the years would come out of the woodwork to call him a fool and laugh at his so-called powers of ratiocination and his calculus of probabilities.
The first thing Edgar did was contact the editors at Ladies' Companion and have them remove the story from the December issue and instead have it published in February. That would give him some time to come up with some sort of solution.
Stop the presses! The main problem Edgar faced was that the first 2 installments had already been published, all of which was meant to lead to the conclusion of the mysterious naval officer being the culprit, and nothing could be done to change that. How could he manipulate his final chapter to come up with a new hypothesis?
The first thing he did was change his conjecture that the thicket was the scene of the murder. He then went about saying how the thicket was most likely staged by the murder to throw the trail in a different direction.
He then states that he is not infallible, that there actually could be other answers, which must have been seriously wounding to his pride, stating, "It should be considered that the most trifling variation in the facts of this case might give rise to the most important miscalculations, very much as in arithmetic an error, which in its own individuality may be inappreciable, produces at length by dint of multiplications a result enormously at variance with truth."
And he ends the story with a total cheat, a letter from the editor saying, "For reasons which we shall not specify, we have taken the liberty of here omitting from the manuscript such portion as details the following up of the apparently slight clue. We find it advisable only to state in brief that the result desired was brought to pass."
This weird editor's note seems to say that because of the detective work, the culprits were caught, but for legal reasons, the editor can't give any more details.
During this frantic time of rewriting his ending, Poe even went to New York City to investigate further. But instead of focusing on the facts of the crime and seeking out answers, he, in typical Edgar Allan Poe fashion, got completely shit-faced. After stumbling around drunk, he discovered his old love, Mary Starr from Baltimore, had married and was living in New Jersey. So he took the ferry to New Jersey and wandered drunkenly about, asking random strangers if they knew where she lived, and finally found her house, knocked, and when she answered, demanded to know if she truly loved her husband, saying,
"You don't love him. You do love me. You love me, you know you do."
Mary just brushed him off, and Poe wandered off. He was found a few days later, quote, "in the woods on the outskirts of Jersey City, wandering about like a crazy man."
Oh, Edgar. Chapter 6. The Stylus. Poe had managed to save himself from utter embarrassment with his last-minute changes to his story, The Mystery of Marie Roget. But he had not been able to declare that he successfully solved the case, even though, in truth, he actually may have solved the case.
The two sons arrested for conspiracy in her murder were soon released. There was absolutely no proof that there had been an abortion performed on her, or that there had ever been abortions at the tavern. None, though the newspapers now printed it as a matter of fact.
And no mysterious doctor was ever found, and the case eventually went cold and remains unsolved to this very day. And no investigation of the mysterious naval officer was ever conducted, and for all we know, this mysterious naval officer could have actually been the murderer.
Meanwhile, Poe still pursued his dream of having his own literary journal, finding a partner named Thomas Clark, who published an ad saying, "The stylus shall be more vigorous, more pungent, more original, more individual, and more independent."
Pungent. When I hear that word, I think it's stinky. Funny to call a literary journal pungent.
It's definitely a little strange. In the ad, Poe was praised as being a Byronic hero and soldier who'd fought in Greece and St. Petersburg. All bullshit, of course. But there was truth in the ad saying that Edgar A. Poe, at 34, had become one of the most distinctive literary voices in America.
But guess what happened? Can you guess? Old Edgar ruined the entire venture by getting completely wasted and going on a scandalous bender. Oh, so fucking typical of poor old Poe.
Thomas had been able to find Edgar a potential job in a Washington, D.C. customs house for $1,500 a year, where he'd only have to work a couple hours a day, giving him plenty of time to write and devote to his magazine. Poe was given an interview for the job with none other than the son of the President of the United States, Robert Tyler, son of John Tyler.
And Edgar showed up for the interview so wasted that he wasn't even allowed in to see the president's son. He was stumbling around, starting arguments, and get this. Oh, this is so sad. He had his coat on inside out, and he refused to put his coat on right side in. Fucking hell, man.
It's a strange hill to die on.
Yes. I can just see him like, I
No.
say, good sir, this coat is not inside out, and I refuse to take it off.
Oh man, not only did he not get the job, but Thomas Clark, scandalized, pulled his backing for the magazine, writing, "The magazine scheme has exploded through the imbecility, or rather through the idiocy, of my partner."
I guess that means that idiocy is worse than imbecility.
Yeah, learned something new. Chapter 7: The Gold Bug. Poe seemed to bounce back from these huge setbacks. He'd sent a story off to a competition in a family publication called the Dollar Newspaper, perhaps not thinking much of it, a story of hidden gold and pirates, with a treasure map encoded in a mysterious cryptogram, a story called The Gold Bug.
He won first place and a prize of $100. And both the money and the recognition was much, much needed. The story became just a huge success and would end up being the most read of all of his stories during his lifetime. It would be widely pirated and printed, Poe estimating that there were 300,000 copies printed. The story would later inspire Robert Louis Stevenson to write Treasure Island.
With this great success, Poe found a new outlet, the lecture circuit. In November of 1843, Edgar gave a speech at the William Wirt Literary Institute in Philadelphia on the poetry of America, where he was billed as, quote, the author of The Gold Bug.
The success of the story saw a sold-out crowd for the lecture, a line going around the block. And his flair for the dramatic, inherited from his actor parents, was in great evidence, and the lecture was greatly loved. Waves of applause. He received $100.
He then gave another lecture a week later for members of the Franklin Lyceum in Wilmington, Delaware. Then on December 23rd at a boys' preparatory school in Newark, Delaware. Then Oddfellows Hall in Baltimore. And finally a lecture in Reading, Pennsylvania.
Robert Morris of the Pennsylvania Inquirer wrote that, quote,
Poe's Poetry in America lecture is one of the most brilliant and successful of the season. Poe's delivery was finished and effective.
Chapter 8. I'm going back to New York City. I do believe I've had enough.
In April, Edgar decided to move with Virginia from Pennsylvania to New York City, moving into a boarding house at 130 Greenwich Street. He wrote to his dear Muddy about their first night there, a very personal and amusing letter, showcasing just how hungry they always were.
Last night for supper, we had the nicest tea you have ever drank. Strong and hot. Wheat bread and rye bread. Cheese. Tea cakes. Elegant, a great dish of elegant ham, and 2 of cold veal piled up like a mountain. 3 dishes of the cakes and everything of the greatest profusion. No fear of starving here. Sis is delighted, and we both are in excellent spirits. She has coughed hardly any, and had no night sweat. She is now mending my pants, which I tore against a nail. You can't imagine how much we both do miss you.
Muddy soon joined them in New York as well, and they eventually moved into the rural Brennan farmhouse that Edgar discovered during one of his long walks.
The little house was located on a 216-acre farm, far from the hustle and bustle of the city, in what today is 83rd Street on the Upper West Side. Now, I actually once lived on 86th Street in New York City, and if you know New York City, it's crazy to think that this area was just vast rural farmland. And about 35 years later, construction would begin on a large Gothic castle-like building of luxury apartments, one of the very first large developments in that area of New York. And the building was called the Dakota. It has long been rumored to be haunted. Roman Polanski would film Rosemary's Baby there, and John Lennon would be assassinated there.
Chapter 8. The Raven. Living out in the rural enclaves of the Upper West Side, strolling through lands that would one day become Central Park, Poe's mind returned to the poem he'd been inspired to start by Charles Dickens' pet raven.
Poe would later say he wanted to write something that he knew would be popular, would appeal to the masses. Something not as esoteric and gruesome, yet still with a dark and morbid tone.
One of Edgar's favorite poets was Elizabeth Barrett, having said about her, quote, "Her poetic inspiration is the highest. We can conceive of nothing more august. Her sense of art is pure in itself."
So he decided to base the structure of his new poem, The Raven, on the complicated rhythm and rhyme pattern of Elizabeth Barrett's poem, Lady Geraldine's Courtship.
Poe worked diligently in the little farmhouse, composing 18 stanzas of 6 lines each. Generally, the meter is trochaic octometer, 8 trochaic feet per line, each foot having 1 stressed syllable followed by 1 unstressed syllable. Poe, however, claimed the poem was a combination of octameter, acolectic, heptameter, catalectic, and tetrameter catalectic, with a strange rhyme scheme that goes from A, B, C, B, 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 to AA, B, CC, CB, B, B, when accounting for the internal rhymes. In every stanza, the B line rhymes with the word nevermore, and are catalectic, placing extra emphasis on the final syllable. He also filled the verses with alliteration, like doubting, dreaming dreams.
It's very complex, very, very musical. And for the narrative itself, Poe envisioned a student, though this is actually never stated in the poem, but a student studying volumes of forgotten lore, similar to the studies suggested in Ligeia. Some theorize this might have been some kind of witchcraft or the occult, stating that bleak December, the month the poem is set in, is a month which is traditionally associated with the forces of darkness. And calling the raven a devil bird also suggests this. This devil image is further emphasized by the narrator's belief that the raven is from the night's Plutonian shore, or a messenger from the afterlife, referring to Pluto, the Roman god of the underworld.
Poe said the raven is meant to symbolize, quote, mournful and never-ending remembrance, end quote. He manages to give Dickens credit in an interesting way. When Dickens wrote about the raven grip in Barnaby Ridge, at one point the bird makes a noise, and someone says, "What was that? Him tapping at the door?" The response is, "'Tis someone knocking softly at the shutter."
Which is so cool, man. What a cool way to give credit.
Yeah, just the connection between the two is so cool. When he'd finally finished with his poem, he was walking down the street and ran into a fellow poet named William Ross Wallace, telling him,
"Well, I have just written the greatest poem that was ever written."
"Have you? That is a fine achievement."
Yes. Would you like to hear it?
"Most certainly."
Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary.
Poe proudly read the entire new poem for his friend, giving a dramatic delivery that emphasized the poem's theatrical nature and grim narrative, finally coming to the end.
And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore.
Edgar's friend said to him, "Why, Edgar, that was fine. Yes, very fine. Uncommonly fine."
Fine? You think it's fine? Is that all you can say for this poem? Fine? I tell you, it's the greatest poem that was ever written.
Edgar first took the manuscript to George Graham, his old boss at Graham's magazine. Graham turned him down, but Poe was in such desperate straits, he did loan him some money.
Poor Poe. I can just see him talking to this stodgy old editor, saying, but this is the greatest poem ever written. And the guy going, sorry, I'm gonna have to pass.
Oh my God. Well, also, talk about, you always hear the stories of famous works being rejected. Like, man, he was kind of right. The Raven might just be the greatest poem ever written, at least if longevity and just general awareness of the, like, is there...
The football team named after it.
Yeah, good God. Poe then brought the poem to the American Review, who bought it. Hooray. They paid him $9. He'd gotten $56 for Murders on the Rue Morgue and $100 for The Gold Bug, so I can only imagine he was perhaps a little disappointed.
Nathaniel Parker Willis, editor of The Mirror, wrote an introduction for the poem, saying it was, quote, unsurpassed in English poetry for subtle conception, masterly ingenuity of versification, and consistent sustaining of imaginative lift. It will stick to the memory of everybody who reads it.
The Raven was printed by the New York Evening Mirror on January 29, 1845, and was an overnight sensation, an immediate cultural phenomenon. Like a hip-hop song would be today, it went utterly viral, was reprinted around the world. Everyone was quoting it, especially that refrain, nevermore.
Though it didn't make him rich, it brought considerable fame, which he relished, reading it in saloons and soirees, having the lamps turned down low to establish the dark tone of the home horror-haunted.
Edgar Allan Poe was now absolutely famous, his name a household word. When he walked down the street in his trademark all-black suit, his coat trails trailing behind him like bat wings, children would follow him, whispering, "The Raven Man! It's the Raven Man! The Raven Man!" And Poe would stop and turn, thrusting his arms wide and gleefully shout,
"Nevermore!"
as the children shrieked and squealed and ran off in giggles.
But the dark shadow of death was never far from the haunted poet, and tragedy always seemed to follow him. The next final years of his life would see more tragedy and despair, more horror, loss, and mystery.
But to hear that, you're going to have to tune in next week, dear listeners, for our final installment on the tragic life and mysterious death of Edgar Allan Poe.
Thank you so much for listening, everybody. We hope you're enjoying this series. And if you want to reach out to us, you got a case you'd like us to cover, if we got something wrong, you just want to say hi, you got some music you'd like us to play, so drop us a line at murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. That's murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com. We will see you next week with the final installment of the mysterious death and the tragic life of Edgar Allan Poe.